Welcome to Positive Recovery MD. If you're listening, chances are you want to create happiness around you and thrive in your life. We're glad you're here and you've come to the right place. This podcast will inspire and motivate you to not merely survive your recovery journey, we'll give you the tools to build or strengthen your foundation to thrive and flourish in your life. Each week, we'll come together as a community to have authentic conversations around addiction, recovery, and what matters. Growth and progress, not perfection. All while developing positive habits for you to utilize in your life. To learn more, please visit positiverecoverymd.com to sign up to receive the daily positive interventions that we'll review, as well as gain access to exclusive Positive Recovery content available only to Positive Recovery MD listeners. All right, let's get started.
Hello and welcome, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, to another installment of Positive Recovery MD's podcast. We have today an amazing guest, Dr. Nicholas Kardaras, who is an internationally renowned speaker, one of the country's foremost addiction experts, and CEO and Chief Clinical Officer of Maui Recovery in Hawaii and Omega Recovery in Austin, Texas. He's a former clinical professor at Stony Brook Medicine, where I might have gone to med school had I not got scholarship at Texas Tech. He has taught neuropsychology at the doctoral level and is the author of Glow Kids, which I want to unpack a little bit, which is about screen addiction or technology addiction. And what's even more alluring to me is how Plato and Pythagoras can save your life. Myself, being a philosophy major, love the ancients, love the Stoics. Love the mysticism of sort of how the original, group of humans who for the first time had enough peace and prosperity. There was enough food, there was not war all the time. So at least a group of us could sit around and, try to figure out what's the best human life? What can we do anyway? So that was published in 2011 versus the more recent Glow Kids, which I think might probably be more alluring to most of you guys. However, he's also written for Time Magazine, Scientific American, Psychology Today, New York Post, Salon, Fox News. He's appeared on everything. You can read his CV and blurb if you want. We're going to go into his life story a little bit, so I'm not going to blow that. But welcome, Nicholas. Glad you could join us.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Jason.
Yeah. So I guess our listeners are getting used to by now the positive introduction. So tell everybody who you are with, different spin, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you gave a little bit of the more traditional version of it. So who I am is somebody I like to think I'm a person who's there for people in presence and in support and in compassion, helping people to find their bliss, as maybe Joseph Campbell would say, because it reflected someone who in my life prior, this will, I guess, get into my story as well, too, but I struggled. I had my own my own premature existential crisis in my early 20s, where I went down certain paths that led me to some really dark places. And so let me back up. I'm the child of Greek immigrants, and the hardest working man that I'd ever known was my Greek immigrant father, who was textbook Greek immigrant, came to this country 36 years old and had been educated back home in Greece, but had to work as a laborer essentially in New York, where we were raised. Had a hard life, my dad did. He survived a Nazi occupation, and he survived a lot of pretty horrific things during World War II, and worked so hard, but he also drank so hard. And so being raised with my father, I got a lot of mixed messages because he loved us, but yet it was pretty hard when he was having his drinking episodes. And so for me as a little kid at the time, it was hard for me to kind of hold that, how can this, he obviously loves his family because he works 7 days a week, 18 hours a day to support us, but yet can be pretty abusive. And so that was part of my shaping DNA, where I took some of that messaging and about working hard, but yet also was a little bit sort of contradictory the way that he showed how he felt towards his family. And so I work hard and I did well in school, but I was pretty conflicted throughout my younger life, and by a series of circumstances, which I can get into more detail later, I went down some wrong paths where my addiction led me to some pretty dark places. And I mean, literally dark, New York City shooting galleries, places where with people, places and things that I'd never really thought my life would be about. And what I learned, from my father to some degree, I didn't give up on myself. And I almost said several times, there was a resilience that came with it. And I kept trying. I kept sliding, but I kept moving forward. Then I kept sliding. And something in my own heart told me to don't give up on yourself. Don't give up on yourself. And as I said, there were many times that I came close, but there was something about that earlier piece. And for me, it was one of my multiple hospitalizations and one of my multiple, I was in a coma and I came out of a coma having had I didn't have a classical white light near-death experience, but something had shifted within me. And I was profoundly thirsty to understand the deeper nature of experience, the deeper nature of reality that led me on the quest of self-discovery and self-improvement. And that process of working through my own addiction and my own self-discovery led me to be really compassionate and necessitated my need to help other people similarly find their path and find their bliss in life. So today, I think I'm I am who I am today because of that rough hero's journey that I went through, where I went through some pretty dark places. And I understand when people are in dark places now. And I also know that there's a light at the other side if certain things happen. And I guess that's the short version of it.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. So being a child of an immigrant who had to work as a laborer in New York, right? So what comes up for me is you have brothers and sisters, and how did you pick yourself up and end up owning nightclubs that were the premier places to go? So how does that happen? The odds are stacked against you.
Yeah. Had it a nice middle class kid from Queens, wound up owning A-list velvet rope nightclubs in the mid 80s, early 90s. Like I said, I was kind of we talk about it in addiction and recovery a lot, it was one of the first phrases I had heard, being an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. And so obviously I had not obviously, but maybe not so obviously, but I had low self-esteem because, I came from pretty humble roots. And when I went to school, I was lucky enough where I went to a specialized public school in New York City called the Bronx High School of Science. And so it was a public school that was a pure meritocracy. You did well on this test, you got in. It didn't matter what your socioeconomic background. So that was impactful for me because it was every flavor of the rainbow went to the Bronx High School of Science. And it sort of exposed me. And this is again, late 70s, early 80s, New York City, pre-Giuliani, New York. So New York at this point was a very vibrant and colorful place. So I was a kid prone to escapism. And my first escape was science fiction because there was a lot of drama at my house. So because when my father would explode, my father would have every 2 or 3 days, as I like to say, if I heard his keys fumbling in the lock, it was time to hide because my father could get pretty angry and violent and explosive. So I was an Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury. I would hide in the closet when my father got drunk, read science fiction or watch Star Trek. I was a big Trekkie. And, I went to a good school. I did well, felt insecure. So when I got into an Ivy League school, which I wound up getting into, and I felt total imposter syndrome being there. And all my friends from college were going on to graduate school. I said, I'm going to check out. I'm not going to go to school. All my friends went off to MBA programs or law school or graduate school. I said, I'm going to go work for a while. And I happened to have a martial arts background. I did a lot of sports as a kid. I played basketball and soccer and football, but I was also a really proficient martial artist because I watched Bruce Lee when I was a kid, and every kid in my generation who watched the Bruce Lee movie wanted to be a martial artist. So I had gotten my black belt when I was 16 or 17. And I got out of college. I was working kind of a dead-end corporate job that I hated. And a friend of mine said the Copacabana, the original Copacabana that they showed in Goodfellas, was hiring doormen and bouncers. And you're a black belt and you want to moonlight and do something exciting. And I felt in such a rut. I felt so bored with my tedious. I was in this management training program at 21 years old. And I went to the Copacabana, and it was the lights and the sound of this nightclub were the new escape. And then back in 1986, New York, this was the cocaine era. This was, Wall Street and Gordon Gekko. And so this was an exciting world that I could escape in and I could lose and reinvent myself in. So in a pretty short order, I worked at the Copa for less than a year. Because I was raised Greek immigrant entrepreneurial hustler, I started a catering business. The catering business took off and I was able to open up my own venue in about 18 months. And so we opened up this little nightclub lounge in the West Village of Manhattan before it had totally gentrified. And before I knew it, Tom Cruise showed up and JFK Jr. And next thing you know, we're in page 6 of the New York Post. And I'm a 23-year-old self-loathing Greek immigrant kid who is owning this kind of hotspot nightclub. And so now my ego is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex with a burgeoning substance addiction problem. That was the short version of how I kind of landed there.
No, that's great. And God, there's a lot of rabbit holes to go into. One of them, I guess, for me, it's really juicy to talk about kids that are raised in homes where there's abuse, whether it's from alcoholism, rage, or mental illness or something else. Escaping is common. So is reading emotions, right? Your limbic system, your fight or flight would go off when you heard the keys jingling because then he was drunk and he couldn't fit it in. And like it was unpredictable chaos. But insofar as what you could control as a kid, you could hide, you could escape. Yeah, some people are voracious readers. Others, a lot of kids in that same situation will escape right now in what the easiest medium, which is a screen, right? With Roblox or Fortnite or TikTok or Snapchat or whatever it might be. How do you approach that, knowing that it's pathologic and really the issue is the family of origin stuff, but it's a lifeline at that age. And I'm not pro-screen. I'm just trying to stimulate your brain. Yeah.
Well, what was interesting for me, because growing up on Star Trek, I was a big Gene Roddenberry fan, and Gene Roddenberry was a tech utopianist. And so I grew up hardwired to believe that technology. Look, I was 10 years old and I would make fake communicators like Captain Kirk and before flip phones. Yeah. And I would play Star Trek and Kirk and that world, that utopia of the original series Star Trek represented something totally antithetical to what my reality in lower middle class Queens was. It was gritty, and this was late 70s New York. New York itself at that point was really on fire in terms of it was a crime-ridden. Right. Yeah. The Bronx is burning, New York, and and when I went to Bronx Science, I had to take the subway to get to high school 3 hours a day. So I was on a subway from Astoria, Queens, New York, to get to the Bronx High School of Science. Was a great school. We have the most Nobel laureates of any high school in the world, actually. But it was in one of the worst parts of the city. And so I used to have to take the train through Midtown, Harlem, the South Bronx, the West Bronx. So I saw muggings and stabbings, and I played sports. So I would take the train home at night at like 10 o'clock at night, go through the South Bronx, and you would hear gunshots. And so Star Trek represented this ideal and technology as the way to maybe create this future where there would, the Gene Roddenberry promise was peace, a meritocracy. There was no currency. There was no. So that was kind of like in my mind. So I wanted technology to be a good thing in our lives. So then, maybe about 14 or 15 years ago, I had a young man that was referred to me that was in a full-blown psychotic episode because he had been playing World of Warcraft 10 to 12 hours a day, not sleeping. So it's sleep deprivation with really immersive game playing. And he was in the Matrix, fully in the Matrix. He didn't know where, he was going through derealization. So he didn't know where reality ended and the game began. And that was an eye-opener for me because it was the first time that I had seen substance-induced derealization, the bad acid trip and the crystal meth psychosis. But I'd never seen a young person who was fully psychotic that was gaming-induced. And so for me, it was interesting. And I said, this is changing their psychiatric state. But I also understood it because this kid came from a pretty rough background. And I could see how tempting it was for him to escape in that world. And what I wrote about in Glow Kids, which was to me a powerful metaphor, the pilot episode of Star Trek was an episode called The Cage. And in The Cage, the Captain Kirk's predecessor was Captain Pike. Captain Pike gets burned in a horrible industrial accident where he's a quadriplegic in a wheelchair who can't speak. He can only beep once for yes or twice for no, this little light on this little futuristic wheelchair. And they find this world of illusion, this virtual reality world where aliens can control people's perceptions. It was a virtual reality planet, essentially, called Talos 4. And Captain Pike, who has this terrible, untenable daily reality, gets told, do you want to live your world as a quadriplegic or live in the fantasy world and it'll feel real? You'll be young, healthy. You'll have a beautiful green woman that you can have as a mate. And, and they asked him, which world would you rather choose? And he was beep, beep, beep. He wanted the fantasy world. So to me, that was the metaphor for a lot of the kids that I started seeing and working with. They had daily lives that they didn't really love or like, and they had a fantasy world that they can escape into. So I did it through books. I was escaping in the fantasy world that was sort of a paperback version of a gaming experience. But these were fantasy worlds that you can understand why some of these kids who were struggling with abuse or poverty or anything else might prefer. And the difference was it was so ubiquitous and so prevalent now that it's easy to escape. To be a drug addict takes time and effort and you gotta, it's not always that available. But meanwhile, the digital was now kind of societally condoned escapism.
Right. It's not as taboo. Like you have to sort of cross some taboo lines.
You don't have to find some dealer in the shifty dark corner somewhere. You can just get it at your local, gigs. Stop.
Yeah. Yeah. Like there was a joke I heard, Elon Musk paid $11 billion or whatever for Twitter, and I just downloaded it for free on the App Store. But in other words, it's
funny.
Yeah. I really like the way that you phrased the original Star Trek as sort of being a utopian, and all the things you said. What I liked about it, I didn't really realize it was utopian, which is silly. Of course it is, was that it was about the meritocracy, I guess, is right into this, but we were all together going out to help, not to colonize or get resources. And it was like, okay, well, if they're not ready for us to sort of interject ourselves, we don't do that.
Yeah.
We don't affect the natural course, like the sovereign nations. We let them govern themselves, right?
Right. They weren't colonialists. These weren't colonialists, and these weren't military ships. These were ships of scientific discovery. Exactly. And it was the first multiracial crew on the history of television, the first multiracial kiss with Lieutenant Lure. So it did really represent a forward-looking utopian society. And in this world, there was no, war had ended. There was no currency, so people didn't have to fight over limited resources but technology led to that. Technology cured it. Diseases. It led to people having abundance in their lives. So it was, and Star Trek today isn't like that. Now Star Trek today is more of like, kind of crash bang and, kind of, action films. But the original Rodham, and in each episode was a philosophical morality tale as well. There were a lot of gray decisions that had to be made. And that's what I also loved. There were the morality plays that there were. People, you had to really look inside and figure out, how do I handle this ethically gray situation? And that's something, it's funny because I've just submitted my third book, my fourth book actually now, and it's called Digital Madness, where I'm combining Greek philosophy with looking at sort of some of the intersection of technology and our psychiatric distress, right? Because now the metrics before COVID was we were the most on fire psychiatrically ever, highest rates of suicide, depression, overdoses. Before COVID in 2019, COVID was kerosene to that fire.
Right.
And now you have like digital platforms like TikTok that are spreading, I'm calling them a form of digital social contagions, because now you have TikTok Tourette's, where influencers who are performatively modeling certain psychiatric disorders are now having hundreds of millions of views and are shaping the mental health of their followers, which is interesting. So now the narrative, when I wrote Glow Kids 6 years ago, the argument was, can technology be habit forming? Can it be addicting? That was like the uphill battle. Well, now we know that that's a done deal. It's technology's habit forming, or it can be habit forming. Now the question is, what is that love affair with technology leading to? We know that you can get more depressed if you're screen staring and isolated and sedentary, but how is it shaping our minds? And so we're seeing an increase in personality disorders, borderline personality disorder. And one of the hypotheses that I'm writing about, that I wrote about in this new book called Digital Madness, how social media is driving our mental health crisis, is a lot of the young people that I work with have a lot of reactivity and a lot of black and white thinking. And a lot of personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder, are typified by black and white thinking and emotional dysregulation. And so I started thinking around the idea of, back in the day, they used to say, Malcolm McLuhan had said, the medium is the message. And our media has changed now so if you have algorithms that are fueled by, they're called an extremification loop, right? What feeds engagement is if I start engaging in content that increases the intensity of my lizard brain or something that I find powerful. So, we know that with YouTube videos or with any digital platform, it's emotional activation leads to more engagement. And so you have this increasing intensity that goes on. And so you have these algorithms that are like heat-seeking missiles of people's emotional reactivity. But the other thing that they do is they're very polarizing. And so, I don't have to tell anybody in the United States 2022 about the political polarization that's happened. And, I don't know how old you are. I'm probably a couple of years older than you are, but unlike anything we've ever seen before, the polarization is so extreme now. And we have to ask ourselves, what's changed? And now when you start looking at social media as vehicles that amplify polarization, because it's almost like they're sentient organisms that feed off of our emotional reaction and they feed the polarity. Is it possible that they're shaping young people's way of processing information into polarity buckets? And that's been my hypothesis, that I don't think some of the 17, 18, 19-year-olds that I'm working with right now, they don't see the nuance or the gray area between it's either black or white, love or hate. There's no nuance in between. And, we call that dichotomous thinking. There's no, so it's such an extreme polarization. And is that being shaped by social media? Because this is the landscape that's raising these children. Whereas if you're over 40, when we went to college, it was a non-issue to sit across the table from somebody of a different political orientation and have a conversation or a debate. And it was oftentimes kind of enjoyable, to kind of debate with someone. Today, what happens when you have somebody who gets a dissenting opinion, political or otherwise? You see almost an emotional breakdown. You see a reactivity, a does not compute meltdown. And I'm hypothesizing that social media is baking that into our psychological DNA in ways that are entirely toxic and unhealthy, and contributing to our fragility and our mental health distress and our issues that are happening. And thus the antidote now goes back to classical thinking, because critical thinking and being able to use what we might call some of the classical ways of exploring our own universe and our own thought processes, using logic and using some things that are died because everything's so postmodernist subjective, can be the antidote. So how do you teach someone who is so emotionally dysregulated and so triggered by opposing ideas to critically think and analyze those ideas in ways that are not distressing to themselves or can be productive potentially?
No, that's brilliant. Yeah. And I think the Greeks had it right, at least, through the Oracle of Delphi. I understand it was, fiction, but if you had a problem, you didn't get a black or white answer, because that's not like life. You got a question or a mystery, because if you're not okay with the gray zone, man, you're going to fall apart. They knew that. Right. Yeah. That's so right. If you could tease out what the meaning was to you and how it best applied, you just go for it. Right. And if it doesn't work, you course correct, but at least nobody's making you think a certain way. And it just dawned on me is how these algorithms are, they're triggered by your past searches and how long your eyes stay on what part of the screen and all that. So that limits what you're exposed to, but there's a lot of ramifications of that you don't learn new things.
Well, because you're in an echo chamber. You're in your own echo chamber. Right. So it only feeds you what it thinks you're thirsty for. So you're not going to get exposed to opposing views, right? Because you're only going to get heterogeneous thinking. because that's what the algorithm senses that you like. So it's preaching ideas to the proverbial choir. The other part that I find interesting is we're seeing, when you work with young people, you're seeing a level of narcissism and egocentrism. People joke around about the selfie generation. But what's really fascinating, because I heard somebody speaking about this a couple of months ago, and it really resonated, because it's the way you just mentioned, Jason, the algorithm feeds or caters to what it perceives as our needs. Think about how that feeds a young person's sense of the world revolves around them, right? If you or I are shopping for a pair of sneakers and we're going to get, the algorithm is going to send us sneaker ads for the next 3 or 4 days, but it's almost a sense of magical thinking, right? Like I think of sneakers and next thing I know, or I search for sneakers, and next thing I know, sneakers are materializing all over myself. For an 8-year-old, that can be very confusing because the digital world responds to my needs. And think about how that feeds a sense of egocentrism. So a lot of the young people, it's funny, like I have no issues with Brene Brown and shame resilience theory. But I think that's more appropriate for a certain generation of people struggling who may have, I think if you're over 40 and you're of a certain background, you may be struggling with some internalized shame. And if something bad's happened to you, I get it. We internalize some things. But a lot of the young people that I'm working with are not struggling with feeling too much shame. And this is controversial that I say this, but a lot of our young people don't feel enough shame. I don't think shame is a horrible thing, by the way. I don't treat shame as, and this is my own clinical philosophy, shame in the appropriate societal sense. And I know there's differentiation between guilt and shame, but that aside, it's a corrective human emotion when you've acted in a way that your conscience knows was incorrect. So if I cheated with my best friend's wife and I feel ashamed about that, I should feel ashamed about that. And this goes back to things like ethical discernment, morality, Kohlberg's the development of morality. Who talks to us as a species, as a society, as our children? Where are the civics courses and the ethics courses that talk about doing the next right thing? Because in the modern political landscape, right, there is no right thing. It's all highly subjective.
You're familiar with
School of Life? Yeah.
And makes a big push for that exact.
But we don't get that in public schools, right? In most public schools, it's kind of like content centric and
science and math and testing,
right? But who? And the third rail is somebody will say, well, who's who? It's subjective. It's culturally subjective to say right and wrong. But we can say that we're not having these meaningful conversations with young people in terms of giving them some sense of moral compass. Because I know certainly a lot of the young people that I work with, they are untethered. So there's no sense of grounding, either cultural or a sense of mooring to give them a sense of just stability. So now the digital echo chamber is shaping them in ways much more profoundly than, let's say, if you and I had a really strong foundational family support, or we were supported in a cultural sense in the way that we felt really connected and rooted, then you have a clearer sense of identity. But now a lot of our young people, from what I'm seeing, are so lost in the drift that void, that vacuum, that need for identity, that need for purpose and meaning in their lives is being filled by all this nonsense, this digital noise of influencers and shaping influences that are so toxic potentially. And that's what I'm seeing. How do you countermand that? And that goes back to classical thinking can be that the answer to the modern can be the ancient, that we've forgotten for the most part. We're not living in that world anymore.
Well, Nicholas,
to our detriment.
Man, I could talk about this seriously for the next 3 hours, but I want to get into the positive intervention. Thank you so much.
Sure.
What's the name of this book that's coming out that combines?
So the new book is Digital Madness, coming out in September.
Oh, right on. Okay. I'm definitely going to get a copy. So moving into the next section of the podcast, we're going to review day 120 from the Daily Guide. And I'll read the quote and the today's PI, and then we'll talk about it. So the quote is from Aldous Huxley. I wanted to change the world, but I found that the only thing we can be sure of changing is oneself. Very, very Greek, very Buddhist, very recovery.
Big fan of Huxley's Doors of Perception, but go ahead.
Yeah. Got right up your alley. Unicorn in the garden, right? So choose one thing about yourself you would like to improve, eliminate, or change. Then Identify one specific action you can take today to move toward that change. Write it down in the morning and act accordingly for the entire day. In the evening, reflect on how well your actions matched your intentions and whether you experienced any surprises or gained new insight. So did you have a chance to do this?
Well, I had a chance to look at it and to want to do it. And so, let me start off by saying, yeah. So the thing that I would like to work on the most had been being more present and having what I feel is a more balanced life. And so now, if I were to analyze myself, which I try not to do, but because of my core insecurity, because of being raised as a Greek immigrant son, I still have that overachieving thing. So that people pleasing, not being able to say no to commitments and obligations still taints my life. And so I find myself oftentimes being overextended and in ways where I'm not fully present in things that I need to be because I'm rushing from one commitment to the next. And I've got a family, I've got children, I've got professional obligations. And because I have a hard time saying no to certain things, I wind up being overwhelmed and sort of, the old Ed Sullivan show, you're spinning the plates and keeping all the plates spinning. Having to learn that I can tell certain organizations or requests, no, I can't do this, is not a sign of my weakness or my inability. It's just a sign of my creating appropriate healthy space for myself and boundaries for myself. So as I wanted to do that for today, I had pre-commitments that were already flooding me today. And I found today was a particularly hectic and not grounded day because I had 17 different things happening today, from meetings and things from both, because I run treatment programs that are in two different parts of the country. So there's time zone issues and then there were some local obligations that I had made. And then we have commitments to my kids had baseball, and we have one of our puppies might be having to get put down because they're ill. And so all, a full life. And yet I feel like I need to be more present for those meaningful things in my life.
Okay.
And so today I wasn't.
So plan for tomorrow, like pick one thing. My experience was like one thing about myself I want to change despite being a doctor, or maybe because of I'm not a great patient. I don't go to the doctor much. I don't go to the dentist. I don't do any of that shit. So I'm 52 and I got my shingles vaccine finally. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do one thing, dentist, shingles. Okay. Got the shingles. Going to get a damn colonoscopy. I'm going to do it.
I just did mine not too long ago. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, man, thank you so much, Nicholas. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, and they shouldn't do it tomorrow, but any interested parties, what's the best way to contact you? Or just say, no, I don't need it. I don't need that, which is fine.
I've got my website, which is www.drkardaras.com. And my email is drk.k@omegarecovery.org. So no, I don't mind being reached. Emails are a nice preferred way of communication. I hate to say it, I'm one of those people that now finds getting a call intrusive.
Oh, it's totally annoying. How dare you?
But Jason, man, I really appreciate, by the way, the unique and creative and insightful way that you do this. I wasn't fully expecting this, and I really appreciate it. It opened up thoughts, and I don't normally talk about my childhood or past that way. I do a bunch of podcasts, and we talk about stuff and content, and I love the way that you did this. So again, hats off to your insight to do it this way.
Well, thank you. And for being a guest, we'll mail you one of these. So this is like, you got the one day, and it says 365 plus a leap year that you can do something every day.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you. And everybody, remember that this is not a dress rehearsal. So please take care of yourselves and take care of each other, just like the original Star Trek. Until next time, see ya.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Positive Recovery MD. Don't forget to visit positiverecoverymd.com to sign up to get your daily positive intervention sent straight to your inbox. Be sure to subscribe to Positive Recovery MD on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts to receive an automatic download when a new episode drops. And as always, if you or someone you know needs help, visit positiverecovery.com or call 877-4-SOBRIETY, which is 877-476 2743. We are here to help.